When Margaret Ellison banged on the door of my cabin at 7 in the morning, I already knew it wasn't going to be a good day. She had that look, the one where her lips are tighter than a jar lid and her eyebrows are permanently stuck in judgment mode. Margaret was the self-appointed queen of the Timber Lake HOA, a woman who treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom and acted like everyone else owed her rent. I opened the door, still in my flannel pajamas and holding a mug of coffee. "Morning, Margaret," her face twisted like I'd insulted her ancestors. "Nicholas Whitford, you are in violation of multiple HOA codes. You've modified the cabin exterior without prior approval, your firewood stack is unsightly," and I sipped the coffee slowly. "It's a cabin, Margaret. We're in the woods, people expect to see firewood." She took out a clipboard like she was issuing a warrant. "As HOA chair, I'm issuing a formal notice. You have 30 days to vacate for non-compliance." I laughed. "Evict me. You're not a landlord." "You don't have that kind of power," her eyes narrowed. "We'll see. Thing is, I'd only moved into Timber Lake 3 months ago. I bought the old Miller place, a beautiful log cabin tucked at the far end of the community, bordering the national forest. I came here after retiring early from a long, stressful career negotiating land deals and zoning disputes for the city. I wanted peace, trees, and a fireplace. Unfortunately, I got Margaret. The woman had it out for me from day one. She didn't like that I didn't show up to her little tea parties, or that I cleared brush without submitting a landscape modification form. I ignored her the first few times. But when she put a neon orange eviction in process sign at the end of my driveway, I knew she crossed a line. I drove down to the county clerk's office that afternoon and pulled every document I could find on the Timber Lake HOA, its charter, its incorporation status, its bylaws. That's when I noticed something odd. The HOA wasn't legally registered, at least not anymore. Turns out, the original HOA was dissolved 5 years ago after the previous president passed away and no one filed the renewal paperwork. But the property deed, that was the kicker. My cabin wasn't just a house on the land. It included the original developer's parcel land that, according to the original 1982 documents, technically held ownership of the HOA's communal assets, including the roads, park, and signage. I blinked at the paper. Wait a minute. I owned the HOA. Back at home, I installed 2 security cameras, one facing the driveway, another pointed at the front door. Just in time, too, because the next morning, Margaret and 2 of her clipboard-toting cronies were standing at my woodshed, measuring the distance between the logs and the fence line. I stepped outside. "You're trespassing." She turned, all righteous fury and windbreaker. "We're conducting an inspection." I held up the property survey. "You're standing on my land, and this HOA you keep quoting doesn't exist, but if you want to test that in court, be my guest." Her face dropped for the first time. She tried to recover. "The board, there is no board," I said. "And if you keep harassing me or stepping on my property without permission, I'll file charges." I wasn't bluffing. I'd already spoken to a lawyer friend who owed me a favor. That night, I dropped off a certified letter at every mailbox in Timber Lake. It explained politely but clearly that the HOA had been legally dissolved. The common areas were now part of my deed, and anyone trying to enforce fake rules would be hearing from my attorney. Then I got a court summons. Margaret, apparently undeterred by facts, filed a lawsuit claiming I was illegally occupying HOA land and demanded my removal from the premises. She cited 27 made-up violations, half of which included things like non-compliant bark mulch and failure to attend mandatory community meetings. I showed up to court in jeans and a sport coat. Margaret arrived with a folder thicker than a Sears catalog and a smug little laugh every time she glanced my way. Then the judge walked in, and everything changed. Judge Marquez adjusted her glasses and thumbed through the case file in silence for a good 30 seconds. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a pocket knife. Margaret leaned forward at the plaintiff's table like she expected a coronation. Her attorney, someone I recognized from radio ads about aggressive representation for neighborhood disputes, whispered something to her, and she gave him a stiff nod. I sat calmly at the defendant's table, the original deed spread out in front of me, with every supporting document cross-referenced and bookmarked. Decades of navigating bureaucracy had taught me how to organize a file like a surgeon laying out scalpels. Judge Marquez looked up. "Miss Ellison," she said, voice flat but firm. "According to your complaint, you are alleging that Mr. Whitford is in violation of HOA regulations and that he must vacate his property due to non-compliance." "That's correct, Your Honor," Margaret said, sitting straighter. "He has repeatedly ignored our community guidelines, altered his property without approval, and refused to acknowledge board authority." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And you are the current president of the Timber Lake HOA?" "Yes," Margaret said quickly, too quickly. "And when was the last time your HOA filed articles of continuation with the Secretary of State?" Margaret blinked. "I am not sure that's relevant. The HOA has functioned continuously for over 20 years. I cleared my throat. "Your Honor, if I may," she nodded. I stood, holding up the stamped paperwork from the county records office. The Timber Lake HOA was administratively dissolved 5 years ago due to failure to file annual reports. There is no current legal entity. There is no functioning board under state law. Margaret shot to her feet. "That's not true. We've held meetings, collected dues." The judge held up a hand. "Miss Ellison, sit down. This court will not entertain procedural chaos masquerading as governance." She turned back to me. "Mr. Whitford, the court has reviewed your property deed. Can you explain the significance of paragraph 12? I nodded. "Yes, ma'am. That paragraph assigns the developer's rights, including control of communal assets and administrative authority, to the owner of the original parcel. That's the Miller cabin. It was never subdivided. Which means, when I purchased it, I inherited those rights." The judge looked at Margaret. "Did your organization ever amend its bylaws or update the charter to reflect a transfer of control from the original parcel?" She hesitated. We didn't think we needed to. That's what I thought," the judge muttered. She turned to the bailiff. "Do we have the corporate status printout?" He handed her a paper. She scanned it, then looked back at Margaret. "There is no legal HOA in Timber Lake. You've been enforcing non-existent rules, collecting dues under false pretenses, and threatening eviction without authority. That's not just a misunderstanding, Miss Ellison. That's fraud." Margaret's face drained of color. Her attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, but she didn't respond. She was too busy staring at the floor. Judge Marquez continued. "Mr. Whitford, your counterclaim states that you believe the HOA has been collecting funds unlawfully. Do you have documentation of these transactions?" I pulled out a spreadsheet highlighting monthly dues payments from residents over the past 5 years, complete with bank statements showing deposits into a private credit union account under the name Timber Lake Community Fund. The account was registered under Margaret's name and 2 other board members who no longer even lived in the neighborhood. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Whitford, when you requested financial transparency, what response were you given?" "They ignored my certified letters. I also submitted FOIA requests for public meeting minutes. None exist." Judge Marquez leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "Court will recess for 1 hour. During that time, I'm ordering a forensic audit of this account. If there is evidence of embezzlement or misuse of funds, this will go beyond civil court. Bailiff, contact the district attorney's office." Margaret's attorney looked like he'd swallowed a cactus. Margaret just looked like she was trying not to pass out outside the courtroom. I stepped into the hallway and dialed Lawrence Kim, a retired CPA who lived 2 cabins over. He'd been suspicious about the dues for years, but never had the leverage to push back. I gave him the rundown. "You're telling me they've been operating off a dissolved charter? That's criminal misrepresentation." "I know," I said. "And the judge just ordered a forensic audit." Kim whistled. "Looks like the Queen's crown's about to melt." When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. The DA's office had already sent an investigator who sat behind the prosecution's bench, taking notes as the judge laid out her findings. "Here's what we now know," she said. The HOA was never legally revived, the dues were funneled into a private account, and there is no record of a democratic election or financial disclosure in over 5 years. Miss Ellison, as the individual controlling the account, you are under investigation for wire fraud, theft by deception, and operating an unregistered organization. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Whitford, you have requested an injunction against all further enforcement actions by this defunct HOA and the return of all communal assets to your management. I am granting that request." Margaret finally spoke. "You can't just give him the neighborhood." The judge didn't even look at her. "I'm not giving him anything. He already owns the rights. You just never bothered to check." Then she picked up her gavel and said, "We are adjourned." Outside the courthouse, a few neighbors had gathered, curious about the outcome. When they saw Margaret escorted out by a plainclothes investigator, whispers started spreading fast. I walked up to Larry Kim and handed him a copy of the judge's order. "We'll need to hold a town meeting," I said. "This time a real one," he nodded. "People are going to want answers." And restitution. Over the next few days, I worked with a small group of residents people like Larry, a retired firefighter named Denise, and a young couple who ran a landscaping business to draft a community charter. This time, everything would be voluntary, transparent, and above all, legal. The more we dug, the worse it got. Margaret had used HOA funds to pay for a new water heater, 2 weekends at a spa resort, and even a set of patio furniture she claimed was for community events. The DA's office confirmed they'd be filing formal charges within the week. I rekeyed the locks on the community tool shed and posted notices informing residents that all maintenance and improvement decisions would be paused until we could hold a proper vote. When Denise knocked on my door with a bottle of bourbon and a grin, she didn't have to say anything. We sat on the porch and passed the bottle back and forth as the sun went down behind the trees. "You know," she said, "I always thought something was fishy about her, but I figured, what can you do? You expose the truth," I said. "And then you build something better." She raised the bottle in a quiet toast, to peace, and to finally being free of the woman who thought she could rule the woods like a kingdom, but peace didn't come right away, not when Margaret had one last card to play. 3 days after the courtroom fallout, a plain white envelope landed in my mailbox, no return address, but the seal was county-issued. Inside was a formal notice from the district attorney's office. They were assembling a criminal case against Margaret Ellison and 2 former board members for financial misconduct, including misappropriation of funds, estate fraud, and unauthorized use of community resources. There was also something else. Attached to the letter was a subpoena request for my security footage. Not just the 2 cameras on my property, but any recordings I may have had from the day Margaret and her companions trespassed near the woodshed. The request caught me off guard. I'd already provided the footage showing them on my land, measuring things and muttering about non-compliant shrubbery. But this was different. The DA's investigator believed they might have found something bigger, something that happened off camera, in the blind spot between the woodshed and the northeast trailhead. I called up Larry Kim. "You remember when they were poking around near the fence line?" "Turns out the DA thinks there's more to it." "What more could there be?" Larry asked. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." I spent the next few hours combing through old footage on the second drive I hadn't reviewed in detail. I'd set up a trail camera last fall to monitor wildlife near the side path where deer often wandered through. I'd nearly forgotten about it. When I finally pulled the SD card and loaded it on my laptop, I expected to see a few raccoons, maybe a black bear nosing around. What I found instead made my stomach twist. One clip, time-stamped from 2 weeks before Margaret tried to serve me with her fake eviction notice, showed her and one of her accomplices, Paul Jensen, the so-called grounds director, dragging a large plastic container wrapped in a blue tarp through the brush. The container was heavy. Paul stumbled twice, and Margaret hissed at him to keep it quiet. They buried it partially beneath a layer of pine needles and loose soil just past the boundary line. I sat back in my chair, the weight of what I'd seen sinking in. That wasn't standard HOA behavior. That was evidence tampering. Or worse, I forwarded the file to the DA's office immediately. The next morning, 2 unmarked vehicles pulled into Timber Lake. A crime scene unit in plain clothes walked the woods with shovels and ground-penetrating radar. By noon, they had unearthed the container. Inside were dozens of envelopes sealed, dated, and water-resistant. Checks, cash receipts, and handwritten ledgers cataloging years of dues paid under the table by residents who never received statements. Some entries were marked with cash-only notations and initials. But that wasn't the worst of it. Taped to one envelope was a letter addressed to M.E. In a neat, feminine script. It was a resignation letter from the former treasurer dated 4 years ago. In it, she accused Margaret of coercing her into signing blank checks and threatened to go public if it didn't stop. The letter was never mailed. That's when the DA's office brought in the fraud division. 2 days later, Margaret was arrested at her home. Not just for mismanagement, but for conspiracy, financial coercion, and obstruction of justice. Her face turned to granite when the officers cuffed her on the porch in front of half the neighborhood. I watched from across the street, arms folded, while her porch plants trembled in the breeze. Larry joined me, arms hanging loosely at his sides. Didn't think it'd go this far. I did, I said. She tried to bury it literally. His gaze drifted to the patrol cars. People are scared, they're wondering if they'll get their money back. They will, I said, but it's going to take time. And paperwork. That night, I called an emergency assembly. We gathered in the old lodge near the lake, the same one Margaret used to lock for board members only. This time, the doors were wide open. I stood at the front, a stack of folders in one hand, the deed in the other. We're not here to point fingers, I began. That already happened in court. We're here to decide where this place goes from here. Dozens of neighbors listened in silence. Some were furious. Others just looked exhausted, but they all wanted one thing: control of their lives back. A man in the back raised his hand. If we're not an HOA anymore, what are we? A community, I said. One that can choose to collaborate or not. But any future organization has to be voluntary, transparent, and built by consensus. Another voice piped up: Sandra, a nurse who lived in one of the smaller cabins near the creek. You're saying we start from scratch, not just from scratch, I said. From the truth. There were nods. Not everyone agreed on every detail, but the relief was palpable. No more fake fines. No more threats about decorative violations or non-regulation mailboxes. People could finally breathe. We voted to form a temporary committee, not an HOA, but a stewardship board to manage immediate concerns like road maintenance and shared utilities. I declined the chair position. I'd done my part. It was time for others to step up. Over the next week, something remarkable happened. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were now clearing trails together. The retired firefighter, Denise, organized a cleanup crew for the old cart path. Sandra coordinated a food drive for 2 families hit hardest by the fake dues collection. Even Paul Jensen's cousin, who'd always kept to himself, offered to rebuild the rotted picnic tables at the lake. And Margaret. She was denied bail. Word came down from the DA's office that she tried to pressure a former board member to destroy old ledgers via a prepaid burner phone. The charges were updated to include witness tampering. The trial was scheduled for early summer. By then, Timber Lake had changed. Not because of me, but because people realized they had the power to fix what had been broken. One morning, I found a basket of muffins on my porch with a note tucked inside. Thank you for not backing down. No name, just flour smudges on the envelope. I left the muffins on the kitchen counter and went out to split wood. The rhythm of the axe against the grain was steady grounding. A hawk cried overhead, circling above the treetops. For the first time since I moved to Timber Lake, the silence didn't feel uneasy. It felt earned. Weeks passed. The stewardship board held its first election. Denise was voted in as chair, Larry as treasurer, and Sandra as secretary. They drafted a charter that allowed residents to opt into community efforts without financial penalty. Everything was done through open meetings, no secret decisions, no fine print, and the funds. Every cent recovered from Margaret's accounts was placed into a public trust, overseen by an independent accountant. The former treasurer, the one who'd written the letter, came forward at the DA's request. Her testimony sealed the case. Margaret was convicted on 6 counts, including financial coercion and fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years, with restitution mandated to each affected resident. She never looked at me during the sentencing hearing. Just sat with her hands clenched on the table, a woman who'd spent a lifetime in control, now at the mercy of the very system she thought she could manipulate. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse and didn't look back home. I took down the last of the security cameras. Not because I stopped being cautious, but because I no longer needed proof of what was broken. Now, I had proof of what was rebuilt. The black Chevy Tahoe pulled into Timber Lake just after sunrise. 2 detectives from the county's financial crimes unit stepped out, quietly making their way to a modest frame tucked between the trees near the western cul-de-sac. No sirens, no lights, just the tight, purposeful movements of people who knew exactly what they were about to do. Inside, they found Paul Jensen half-dressed and groggy, his front door barely latched. He didn't resist when they served the warrant. He just stood there blinking while they boxed up his laptop, a drawer full of receipts, and a stack of contractor invoices with dates that didn't match any actual work done. At the same time, 2 other officers arrived at a storage facility 15 miles out, using bolt cutters to enter a unit listed under a shell company with Margaret's signature on it. Inside were banker boxes labeled Garden Upkeep, Meeting Minutes, and, bizarrely, Emergency Fund Do Not Open. One of the boxes held a ledger detailing over 30 cash withdrawals over the past year, all signed off by Margaret, Paul, and a third name, Tom Vassell. That name hadn't surfaced before. I got the call from the DA's office at noon. They wanted to meet, not in a courtroom but at the Timber Lake Lodge. It was the first time they'd ever asked to come to us. The young assistant DA, Monica Reyes, arrived with a canvas satchel and a folder thick with evidence. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We've confirmed another layer," she said, flipping open the folder. There was a fraudulent insurance policy taken out on the old community center. It was signed by Margaret and Tom Vassell, listed as renovation trustees. The policy paid out nearly $80,000 after a staged roof collapsed 2 winters ago. Denise leaned forward, brows furrowed. "The roof collapsed that shut it down for repairs." Monica nodded. "Only it was never repaired. The claim was filed, the check deposited, and the money rerouted through a landscaping company owned by Tom's cousin. That company doesn't exist anymore." Larry exhaled slowly. So this wasn't just mismanagement. They were running a full-blown racket and laundering money through fake contractors while pretending it was for community services, I said. "How far back does it go?" "We're still digging," Monica replied. "But we've already found bank statements going back 6 years that show a pattern of fictitious expenses and inflated maintenance costs. We think some of the checks residents wrote were being altered after deposit." "The handwriting comparisons are pending." Sandra set her coffee down without drinking it. "How many people knew?" Monica hesitated. "At least 3 were actively involved. A few others may have been complicit in smaller ways. We'll be interviewing them." There was a long silence. The lodge, once a place of exclusion and backroom decisions, now felt like a war room. I stood. "What do you need from us?" "Testimony. Financial records. Anything that shows what residents were told versus what actually happened. Your community's already been instrumental in exposing this. Now we need to make it airtight. We spent the next week compiling everything. The stewardship board issued a call for documents, and people came out in force. Receipts, emails, letters Margaret had sent over the years threatening late fees if dues weren't paid in cash. One couple brought in a manila envelope full of flyers Margaret had hand-delivered to their porch, warning they'd be blacklisted from community services if they didn't contribute to the emergency repair budget. Every piece fit together like a jigsaw puzzle made of lies. The DA's office moved quickly. With the mounting evidence, they secured arrest warrants for Tom Vassell and one of Margaret's former board allies, Carol Hensley. Tom was picked up in Arizona trying to withdraw $15,000 from a joint account. Carol turned herself in when she heard the charges: bank fraud, wire fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. The charges weren't just civil anymore. The state filed a RICO case, the same kind used for organized crime, that had never happened to an HOA in our county before. A month later, the courtroom was packed. Monica handled the prosecution, her voice sharp and deliberate. She laid out the case with surgical precision. Forged documents, fake invoices, laundered funds, fabricated maintenance emergencies, and a network of shell companies used to siphon money from the community under the guise of governance. She submitted the trail cam footage, the resignation letter, and the resigning treasurer's sworn affidavit as core evidence. The judge, this time a federal magistrate, didn't hide his disgust. Margaret's defense tried to paint it all as a misunderstanding. They claimed she was trying to preserve the community's character and that the funds were used equitably. The judge interrupted. Equitable use does not involve laundering insurance payouts through fake businesses or demanding cash-only payments without receipts. When the verdict came, it was swift. All 4 defendants were found guilty on all counts. Margaret was sentenced to 9 years in state prison, with mandatory restitution of over $200,000. Tom and Carol received 5 and 4 years, respectively. Paul Jensen, who cooperated late in the investigation, received 2 years with 5 years probation. The restitution fund was placed under independent oversight, with monthly reports sent to every resident. Within 60 days, every household received a refund check. Some were small. Others were in the thousands. That night, the lodge was full again. But this time, there was music. Someone brought in a speaker and played bluegrass while the kids ran around the fire pit. Denise grilled burgers, and Larry handed out soda cans from a cooler. No speeches, no formalities, just the sound of people reclaiming their space. I sat on the porch steps, watching the lights twinkle through the trees. Sandra came over and sat beside me, brushing pine needles off her jeans. "You think they'll ever try something like this again?" she asked. "Maybe," I said. "But not here, not anymore." She tilted her head. "You staying in the leadership circle?" "No," I said, smiling slightly. "I'm going back to my porch and my books." "You all have this handled now." There was a quiet moment between us, filled only by the hum of laughter and cicadas. "You know," she said, "if you hadn't dug into those records, we'd still be writing donation checks for imaginary sprinkler heads." "Let's just say my career had its uses," I replied, "and I don't like being lied to." She nodded. "Well, thanks for burning the weeds out." I watched as a group of teenagers chased each other with glow sticks near the dock. The lake was calm, the air smelled like cedar and charcoal, no tension, no fear, just life lived honestly. The next morning, I walked the eastern trail, the one that bordered the old shed where Margaret had buried her secrets. A new sign had been posted: Community Commons open to all. Below it, someone had nailed up a wooden plaque carved with the words, "Truth grows where lies are cleared." I didn't know who carved it, but I didn't need to. Timber Lake had finally become what it was always meant to be. Not a kingdom ruled by fear, but a place where people looked out for one another and where no one, Not even a clipboard queen with a taste for power could ever claim ownership of their neighbors again.